Hello, little saltines. How you doing? Thank you so much for joining us for another episode of the Salty Witches podcast. Um, I am flying solo today. Austin is busily preparing for a class he'll be teaching tonight on the witches' familiar spirits as they are understood to exist in the context of traditional witchcraft. So it's just me today. Hopefully this doesn't disappoint too many of you. I understand I'm not as fun or as exciting as Austin is, but I think I provide some good information here and there. Um, Today, I wanted to talk about a few different things. I've got a response that I want to issue to a listener to last week's episode, and then I do have a couple of really exciting listener questions. But before we get into any of that, I wanted to talk very briefly on astrology, or rather, planetary and stellar influences in just human life. So right now, a lot of people are up in arms or are really stressed out about a lot of the planets that are in retrograde, and many of these planets have been in retrograde for weeks now, right? But in a lot of like social media, spiritual kinds of situations, I'm seeing a lot of like, oh, retrograde, oh, blah, 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 planet, oh, this, oh, planet, and one of the things that I think is really kind of missing a more nuanced piece of that discussion, something that should be happening a bit more commonly, and something that I think a lot more of astrologers or astrologists, whatever the term is, right, should be kind of putting out there when this information comes up, is the significance or the importance of knowing how those planets first connected to that person, to the individual, right? And I guess what I mean by that, and bear in mind, I am not an astrologer. Okay, I am a magician who works with and incorporates stellar or planetary magic into his work. Okay, so my terminology and my understanding of some of these things as they would relate to astrology is really probably not what it could be. Okay, but having said that, I think it's good for us to remember that each of us, as we are born into this life, has a birth or a natal chart. Okay? And you can have those done by professional astrologers. There are apps on your cell phone now that can do a quick and ready birth chart for you, right? And the purpose of that is to see or to have a clear idea of where particular planets and other celestial bodies will align into your houses, and how as a result they will influence you in this life, right? This is one of the things that is never really talked about, or at least I have yet to see this being discussed in conversations around what we see as malefic planetary influences or things like retrogrades. um, when a planet goes into retrograde, it is going to affect you on a very personal and a very different level than it may infect or affect me. Infect, sure, we'll go with it. Infect me, right? Um, because it's going to depend a lot on where that planet maybe fell into your birth chart. If that planet is a source of influence or power within your birth chart, and how you have always connected to that planet. Right. And that's something else that needs to be discussed, I think, is that planets go into retrograde, planets move through patterns in our solar system. They do things like all the time. We are interacting and influenced by these energies all the time, and yet for some reason people always lose their shit when we hear about something going retrograde, right? So you need to look into that. I think that if we were to look at, say, like Mercury, which I believe is also still in retrograde, okay, if we look at, say, something like a Mercury retrograde, and you were to do, some digging into your birth chart, and you were to see like, oh, well, Mercury has a lot of influence in this particular house that influences relationships and those kinds of deep, personal, intimate kinds of connections. Mercury is going to have, as it goes into retrograde, negative influence over that particular aspect of your life, or you're probably likely to feel Mercury's energies more keenly in that aspect of your life. Okay, as Mercury moves into retrograde, or through other different types of things, because the planets do other stuff too. They don't just go into retrograde. Okay. That's going to be something that I would say you would need to be much more concerned about, because that you're looking at a situation where now we see breakdowns of communication between you and your relationship partner, you and other close personal connections, right? That would be, I think, of much more concern than, say, Mercury falling into retrograde, as it also holds planetary influence under your first house or the house of the self, right? In that situation, all you're really looking at is maybe just some confusion, maybe some struggle around like your internal monologue, or maybe the way that you kind of connect as an individual, as a person, to the systems of administration and commerce in the world around you, right? Like, probably not quite as much you need to worry about there, right? So this is a conversation that I think needs to be had a bit more and more, okay? And there needs to be more of an understanding that all of these planets and celestial bodies are going to hit you differently, at least a bit, slightly, more than slightly. They're going to hit you on a very personal level, okay? And what a retrograde does for me or to me is maybe not going to be what that retrograde does for you too, okay? So just something to consider. And those of you who really like to get, who feel a degree of concern over how planets hold influence in your life, and they do. I don't think they hold quite as much influence as maybe we give them credit for, but they do hold influence, right? If you're concerned about that, though, I want to encourage you to really kind of check out to make sure that you have looked at your birth chart, that you have a clear idea of where those planetary bodies and even stars and asteroids and things, where they sit in your chart, in your birth chart, because that will give you much more information or give you a better way to anticipate how something like a retrograde or other planetary movements are going to affect you personally. Okay. Yeah, we need to quit demonizing our planets, right? And we need to quit absolving ourselves of personal responsibility for things every time something goes into retrograde, right? Or has some other sort of malefic manifestation in our lives based on its solar system movement, right? All right, so that's all I'm going to say on that. Okay, so I want to go in and I'm going to try to get through this really quickly. Okay, we had a listener contact us on last week's episode who was really upset with us for like a number of reasons. They sent us a whole bunch of information about what they thought was wrong with us and wrong with our podcast. Okay, and we appreciate that feedback, right? Because that if we agree with you and we can see that you have a point, that gives us room to improve, right? Or it gives us an indication like, oh, we'll be better about this, right? But I am going to say, unfortunately, after reading and interacting and responding to this person's comments on to our episode, I'm going to honestly say that I'm not in agreement with this person's assessment of who we are in our podcast. Okay, and I'm going to elaborate on that now. Okay, you were upset with the information that we shared and the position that we took on really what we were sharing. It wasn't just the information itself, it was the way that we personally were presenting the information, right? And to that, all I can say is that we have, from episode 1, made it quite clear that we are professional witches and occultists who have chosen to be a resource to others who are seeking. Okay, and we do most of that for free. Okay, I'm not going to apologize to you for putting out information in a snarky and in a salty way. We are these salty witches. Okay, one. Okay. Two, I have to ask, and I didn't when we had a conversation on this in the last few days, but if you are at all familiar with the podcast, you would know that we always tend to be sassy and a bit rude. And yes, and we can come across as being very critical and judgmental. If you're a newer listener to the podcast, and that's just one of a few episodes that you listen to, I want to encourage you to maybe give us another chance to go further back and actually kind of get a feel for how we're presenting. Okay, because while yes, we can be salty, we're giving you good information. Okay, and that's the next piece I want to talk about. Okay, in addition to wanting to be a reliable source for information, and doing and presenting the way that we do, you'd indicated that we tend to state a lot of what we do, the information we present, we tend to state things with a lot of conviction. Okay, and if I didn't have conviction in what I believed, I wouldn't be putting out a podcast to begin with, or doing any of the other things that I do, including teaching, reading for people, running the shop. Okay, if I didn't have conviction in what I was presenting, I shouldn't be doing any of that, right? And I would hope the same would be true for anybody else. Otherwise, there's a real issue with integrity there, right? So I wanted to clarify that by again saying that we present real information on a wide variety of topics on this podcast. And that information is presented with conviction because we trust our knowledge and our experiences when it comes to these things. Okay, we don't talk about things that we haven't experienced. Okay, we might reference them, but you are never really going to find us going in depth into something that we are not directly involved in or have experienced. Okay, and not only do we have conviction in our knowledge and experiences, but we have conviction and trust in the knowledge and the experiences of many other people that we are familiar with who are also working as professional practitioners and teachers. And the many people over the years who have been teachers to us. Okay, when we speak on the podcast, when we express what you believe is an opinion, okay, you must understand that that is not only our voice, but that is information that is being presented, and those are the voices of many, many other people behind that. Okay, otherwise we wouldn't be talking about it. Okay, so there's the source of the conviction. Okay, and I am again, I can't apologize or make excuses for that because it is what it is. Right. You mentioned that you were upset at the overly critical and judgmental nature of our delivery. And it reminded me that once upon a time, in any situation where we found ourselves working very closely with someone that was a mentor, a teacher, someone that was really helping us in some way, right? Okay, that once upon a time, it was actually normal and expected to receive criticism and judgment of someone like a teacher. Okay, that was a component of the teaching. That was a component of the process of your learning and your growth. Okay. I think that with the way that social media has affected our communication style, I think in the way that social media has made a lot of people extremely sensitive about things like that, that hearing criticism and judgment from someone, I think, has become a huge problem. And I honestly, I don't know what to do about that. But I am going to say that anybody that you're learning from that is going to coddle you and only give you information that enforces your bubble of belief is not a good teacher. That is someone that you really probably should not be learning from. Right? The things that we discuss on this podcast, beyond just being delivered in ways that can be critical and judgmental and harsh at times, right? Beyond that, the things that we discuss on this podcast are going to be difficult topics for a lot of people because we are challenging. That is one of the things that we are doing with this podcast. We are challenging the superficial spiritual tourist nonsense that a lot of people have been confused by for many, many years, right? We are, again, trying to present accurate, structured, and results-oriented information. Okay, if it's not something that we know is accurate, structured, and is going to give you results, we're not going to talk about it. Okay, whether you want to hear it or not. Okay, if we ever do say anything on the podcast, and this goes to all of our listeners, if we ever do say anything on the podcast that you disagree with, I want you to see that as a good thing. And I know that sounds weird, okay, but in a moment where somebody presents something to you, something that you disagree with, right? That gives you an opportunity to check in, right? With yourself, certainly, right? Like, oh, this is new information. This isn't what I thought, right? This gives you a moment to check in with your personal belief system, with what you already have within you, right? And to see, if maybe this is an opportunity for a little bit of self-expansion or growth or healing or just really good personal work, right? Okay, particularly when that information is coming from a reliable source. If you're hearing shit from like QAnon, or these other ridiculous places that, are filling people's heads with all kinds of nonsense and conspiracy, right? Whatever the source may be, right? You're getting information on witchcraft from somebody who's, like read 2 books, has been practicing for 3 months, and has proclaimed himself a high priestess, right? Probably not getting good information, right? But you're getting information from this podcast from people who have been actively involved in this work. Like between the two of us, Austin and I have a cumulative 50 plus years of experience in not only traditional witchcraft, but Wicca, shamanistic practices, folk magic, occultism. We have done it all. And we're giving you that information. And we have been very fortunate over the years to have worked with some very amazing teachers who are still to this day way more knowledgeable than we probably are on all that shit. Okay. And so you're getting information from a reliable source. Okay. And because of that, I want you to be a little more open to what we present, even if it's something that doesn't immediately sit well with you. That is an opportunity for you to grow, and again to basically to level up a bit as a human in that moment, and certainly as a magical practitioner. Okay. A couple of the things that you stated were also really problematic for you with that episode is that you'd indicated that we were woke and overly political. And all I can say to the accusation of being woke is you're goddamn fucking right. And anybody in the world today who is going to look at clearly and have a clear appreciation and understanding for what is going on in our world today, all of the human issues that we see, like just human injustices, what we are doing to our planet, just all of the evils, the things that we identify as the evils in our world today. If you can look at that shit and then still say that someone, when they question those things, is woke, you're the problem. You're the problem. Okay. To take the position in the world that we live in today that really anything is woke, you're part of the problem. And dropping that word in the way that you did is really little more than an excuse to hinder some much needed progress. Okay. So stop. We are political, absolutely. And we have said over the podcast many, many times that witchcraft is inherently political. It has to be. The roots of witchcraft are political. Okay. And if there's anybody who cannot see or understand that, all I can say is you have not been paying attention to what has gone on in human society worldwide, or just the world in general, in easily the last several centuries. Right. Witchcraft it always has been, it always will be political. So if you think we're too woke or we're too political, you probably need to find a different podcast to listen to. We're just going to say that. Okay. All right. Again, I do want to apologize to you. It is never our intent to disappoint a listener, right? But I also have to say, if you've listened to a few episodes, you really probably should have had a clear idea of what you were in for. You know, um, you don't have to agree with everything that we say on the podcast. None of you do. None of you have to agree with everything that we say on the podcast or anything. But if you're not agreeing with anything, I got to ask you what the hell you're listening to us for, right? But again, it's important to remember that new information can force us to reconsider old ideas, and that can be uncomfortable. But we owe it to ourselves to take the risk, right? And to maybe be uncomfortable. Spiritual growth, particularly within the traditions that we talk about most on the podcast, is going to be uncomfortable. It has to be. Growth doesn't come with comfort, or I should say, comfort doesn't come with growth. Meh. All right, listener questions. So we have a really cool listener question, actually two really cool listener questions. First one, okay, this one comes from someone who was recently in the Northwest. And while in the Northwest, and I'm going to paraphrase her quite a bit to kind of save a little bit of time, okay? But this person was recently in the Northwest, and while they were there, they were a witness to a lightning, a thunderstorm, right? A really, really heavy storm. Okay. And while they were there and they were watching the interactivity of the thunder, the lightning, these things, they started to actually feel an emotional connection to the energy of the weather. Right. And because of that, they took that connection one step further and actually started to consciously send out intent around like I want a lightning bolt, right? I want a lightning bolt, right? I want thunder, I want a lightning bolt, and they were in essence kind of like conjuring or playing with this storm, right? And through that experience, it kind of showed them like, oh wow, like there could be something to this, and so they ask us, basically like is weather witching like a thing, right? Do people do this, right? And the answer is yes, of course. Historically, you're going to find a lot of things documented around witches, how we interacted with the weather in our communities and in particular areas of our country and the world, right? Most of that information is going to be kind of written with a negative kind of a lens, right? A lot of it is Christian stuff, out there trying to say like, oh, witches are evil, they'll blight your crops and they'll make sure that you don't ever get any rain and things like that. And to be completely honest, I can't say that maybe there wasn't a witch or two out there that didn't do something like that, but to blight the land in a particular area or to hinder the weather in a way that it was going to bring damage to the land, particularly when it's land that we also live on, um, you're not going to find a witch that's going to have done that. Why? Like cut your nose off to spite your face, right? Like, why am I going to blight land when I also need to grow food from this land, right? So a lot of that's crap and basically just Christian propaganda. But you're going to find, yes, that witches are known all over the world, and not just witches, folk magicians, other kinds of spiritual practitioners and magicians. They are going to have always been associated with working with the weather and typically calling on rain or working to calm storms. Okay, so yes, it's very much a thing. Okay, and you asked for some reliable sources because it can be tricky to learn about this. Okay, two books that I'm going to recommend you look at, and again, neither of these is going to be completely about weather witching. Okay, I don't know that there really is a book out there on working with the weather in witchcraft that would really be considered a complete resource. Um, you can look to old grimoires for things like that, but a lot of that's going to be really a lot of that information is not reliable. For one reason, we really don't know who wrote a lot of those old grimoires. Not really. So you can look that route if you want to, particularly if you have more of an interest in like ceremonial kinds of magic. But in more modern practice, I would recommend the book Earth Nature, Techniques of Natural Magic, which was written by Scott Cunningham. Okay, a little bit of an older author for some of you anyway, right? Not older for me, but maybe for some newer practitioners. Okay, and Scott Cunningham's work is dated. It was written many years ago, and some of what's in there has not aged very well. And there is certainly going to be pieces in there that are going to today's understanding be seen to be appropriative, and maybe a little problematic politically, right? But you kind of we all have to kind of figure out where we sit on that. Is there still good information to be found, even if we have to kind of sift through some maybe not so good stuff, right? But I know that book has some very good like practical information on working with weather and elements. Okay, the other one I want to mention is much newer. It is called Water Magic, and it is written by Lilith Dorsey. Okay, I love Lilith Dorsey. I know that she's another figure in the contemporary magical practitioner community that people either tend to kind of love or hate, right? But I think that she's put out some good information, and Water Magic will be a good resource for you because it does talk about things like water elementals, working with rain, and water is really kind of seen as the foundation of so much of our weather. So having an understanding of that is really going to be helpful to you. Beyond that, I want to encourage you to actually develop some of your own personal connections to weather. One of the things that I have done personally, and that I always encourage people to do when they're looking at weather magic, is to actually learn how weather phenomena happen from a scientific basis. If you want to be working weather or conjuring storms in a sense, and you want that storm to really kind of have like a good build of thunder and lightning, right? You might need to look and into and learn a little bit about how positive and negative ions form in clouds, right? Like it's good to have that knowledge, as witches we always work with science. Witchcraft is not meant to we're not thumbing our nose at science, right? We're not throwing science to the side, right? We work with science as witches, right? We should. Okay, you're going to get a much better results if you work with science in your magical practice. Okay, so that's one method. Another thing that I found has worked really well over the years is to develop knowledge of energetic techniques that allow you to create focuses of charge or vortexes. You can do this with yourself very easily. You can raise a vortex, and there are many ways to do this. But the whole purpose in doing that is that the vortex is meant to kind of call or draw in the energy that you want. And you can use this approach to really any kind of magic. But you're drawing and you're attracting, in this instance, specifically clouds, humidity, the kinds of things that are going to help you to build weather, right? Or weather phenomena, right? As you've experienced on your own, you can always work really effectively with existing storms or existing weather phenomena, right? Sympathetic magic is another really good approach to weather. Sympathetic magic is just a good approach to really any kind of magic, to be honest, but you can see some really cool stuff achieved with weather with very simplistic, natural kinds of elements. One that I've worked really well with over the years is I'll go and I'll find a stone, just any stone, doesn't matter, it doesn't have to be anything fancy, but just a stone, and I'll talk to the stone first, right? I'll be like, hey, are you cool working with me? And the animistic spirit of that stone will typically give me some indication like, yes, okay, great, but just bring me back here when we're done, right? Or sometimes it's a no, and then I need to find another stone, right? But I try to find something that's probably like a good, like maybe like the size of my palm, not too big, right? Not too big or too small. And I'll put that in a bowl, and I will name that stone for the area, the land where I need to see rain, okay, or whatever kind of weather effect, right? And then I'll take a cup of water, and I'll slowly pour that water over that stone as a sympathetic representation of rain coming into that area and falling over that land, right? And during that time, you've raised your power, right? You've got your witch fire going, right? You've raised your power. You're praying, you're incanting, you're letting and shaping your intent with your words, right? And say things out loud, right? And it's always when you're doing spell work, say things out loud, right? Whispering and quietly praying your spells is really not doing a whole lot of good. You need to get that stuff out. Okay. But to do that and then to see then what results from that working, because that has worked very effectively for me over the years. Okay. There are a number of other things that you can do, but I want to encourage you to experiment and try. Think of, again, as I was just mentioning, sympathetic ways for you to embody the area that needs to see the weather, right? And then also beyond that, what it is that you can see that would then be a representation of weather, right? And have fun with it. When you're working weather, you need to remember that consequently, or potentially, excuse me, potentially, that the consequences of your work will be affecting many, many people. So you need to be really careful with that. You need to consider the potential collaterals of something like that, right? You don't want to conjure weather even in the process of like, oh, this will be a good thing, right? Like this area is really dry. Like I live in a desert climate, which is one of the reasons why over the years I've worked a lot to conjure weather or a rainfall specifically. But you've got to be really careful with that, right? If you are living in a desert climate, say a place like Southern Arizona, and you're working your weather and you're not really careful about what it is you're asking for or the way that you're envisioning that spell when it kicks off or what that weather will be, and you're calling rain, you could potentially conjure up a monsoon and you've got then a flooding situation in an area of the world that really is not meant to be able to handle land, that is not meant to handle a large quantity of water, right? So you've got to be careful about that. You need to really be considering that. Beyond that, I think it's also good to be mindful of existing weather patterns around the world, and in areas specifically where you're trying to manifest weather, right? So some good practical pieces there, I think. Okay. This question comes from Nora, and thank you so much for this. If you have any other questions, please contact us again. We love to hear from our listeners, good or bad. We love to hear from our listeners because, again, it helps us to continue to do what we can for you. Right. Next question. Hey, this one comes from a practitioner in North Wales. We have a lot of people from that area of the world who listen, and that's really exciting because when we started this, I don't think we anticipated that we would get listeners even like outside of our little state here in the US. So it's always exciting to see someone in another area of the world who's listening. So thank you so much. And you've been practicing for a few years now, and you've got some really good stuff going on. You identify as a sensitive and intuitive and an aspiring mystic. We're all aspiring mystics, all of us, always, right? But you've been at it for a while now. I think you could probably drop the aspiring. I would say 4 to 5 years of dedicated practice. You're a mystic at this point. All right, so they go on to say, and they share a good bit of detail. So again, I'm going to paraphrase this, but they are working very closely with an entity and have been for a few years right now, or at this point. And this entity has been overall very positive. This has been an entity that's been very empowering to this person. This entity has shown up and has helped them to really heal, particularly through some old traumatic kinds of things. And this entity is just in general just been just a boon to their life, every sense of their life, even the mundane stuff. Right. The one problem that they've had in working with this entity is that this is an entity that does seem to create or does bring up altered states of consciousness. Okay. And this listener has qualified, they qualify this as spiritual psychosis. Okay, but I want to be really clear. I want to talk about just that term for a moment. Okay, spiritual psychosis, if you look at it as it would have been understood in older traditional practices, shamanistic practices, folk practices, whatever, spiritual psychosis, or what we identify today as spiritual psychosis, would actually have been and is, to be honest, still considered a necessary part of many of those practices. It was necessary to be able to kind of access that altered state, to be able to reach, to communicate with spirit, to reach the spirit world, and ultimately to work magic. So we need to be careful about that term, spiritual psychosis. I think, again, it's better, as I mentioned this a moment ago, to refer to this as something like accessing of altered states, particularly in your instance, listener, because you've made it very clear that as these are happening, excuse me, as these are happening, that you are momentarily losing control, but you come back to yourself relatively quickly. While you're in that altered state of consciousness, and this spirit is kind of more in charge of some of what's going on. Understandably, that's a little alarming. That's a little scary, right? Because you're no longer in control. But you, as you come back out of those altered states of consciousness, you are then immediately grounding. You're coming back to yourself. You are putting yourself right back into your normal routine, right? Both day-to-day stuff and spiritual stuff, right? This to me actually sounds like this is healthy. This seems to me like an ideal way to be working with an entity that would have this kind of manifestation. So I don't think you're necessarily doing anything wrong. The challenge that we see with something like spiritual psychosis, as it can be a negative thing, is it will create a lot of harm or disrupt an imbalance in our life just in general, right? People who truly fall into what I would identify as spiritual psychosis are people that are totally out of control with their spirituality. They are so focused on the spiritual that their mundane, their day-to-day lives fall apart around them. These are the kinds of activities that hinder their personal development, their relationships, their family, their jobs, right? Anytime that you are doing work that is requiring altered states of consciousness, right? Or you're doing that, you're accessing altered states of consciousness. If you need to be paying attention, or we all need to be paying attention to how that is manifesting, what the consequences of that are over time. Okay, if it's in general proving to be a positive thing, then I'm going to say you probably don't need to worry. Okay, if you're seeing that this is creating a problem, new problems, exacerbating old problems, or maybe triggering other kinds of things that could be going on with you, right? Mental health issues, emotional health issues, or whatever, then you probably need to be a bit more careful. And in that situation, I would say you probably need to find another way to work with that spirit, or it might be better for you long term not to work with that spirit. Okay. But from what you shared, it sounds to me like you've got a really good thing going on here. Okay. So I would say you probably don't need to be too concerned. Okay. To continue on with your questions, you stated that you've come to identify the spirit as Babylon. And a lot of people hear that word and they go to like the kingdom of Babylon as documented in the Bible and in a lot of old grimoires and other kinds of texts, right? But this is not Babylon as in the kingdom of Babylon. This is Babylon as in the archetype of the divine feminine, okay? Which you're going to most popularly see written about or documented in the works of Aleister Crowley, particularly in his work around Thelema as a spiritual practice and the OTO. You've mentioned here that you've also done a little bit of reading into the works of Jack Parsons, which you have found to be unreliable. I would agree with your assessment there. I think while Jack Parsons provided some really interesting stuff over the years, I don't think that, we'll just say I would probably not use any of Jack Parsons' information as a foundation for a spiritual practice. Okay. But you're working with this energy now and you're looking for other resources. One of them you mentioned, this would have been one I would have mentioned, Peter Gray's book, The Red Goddess. Peter Gray, I think, produces or publishes his books under Scarlet Imprint, which is a publishing firm for occult books that comes out of the UK. A little harder to find here in our area of the world, but where you're at, you probably have a little easier access to those books. But The Red Goddess is I think an excellent book. I recommend Peter Gray's work to a lot of people. I just find that Peter Gray has a really refreshing way of being able to connect very old kinds of beliefs and philosophies and ideas and practices, and connecting those to modern or contemporary practice. I think they just do a really good job at that. Beyond that, I kind of like the way that they write. I also recommend Apocalyptic Witchcraft, another Peter Gray book that's really good. I think particularly in modern times. Anyway, so good book there, good reference there, I think. You'd mentioned that your look into Thelema and the OTO has been also a little less than satisfactory, and I'm gonna have to agree with you on that. I have not had good experiences with Thelema. Really Thelemites, to be honest. It's kind of like Christianity, right? It's not the church I have a problem with, it's Christians. That's kind of the same for me and a few other people I've talked to when it comes to Thelema and the OTO specifically. It's not the philosophy or the information of the practice, it's a lot of the people that are involved. And I'm not sure what to do with that, right? Yeah, but you're not alone there, right? So yeah, you're beyond that, you're talking here about having found some good practitioner friends who are also very supportive. And that's amazing. I'm so happy to hear that because it can be really hard to find reliable sources of information, but it can be even harder to find a community and a group of people who actually get you and support what you're doing. Not only support you as a person, but support what you're doing in your practice, right? So I'm very glad to hear that. All right. Oh, you also mentioned that you love the podcast and that we've been very helpful. I'm very glad to hear that. Thank you so much for letting us know. All right, so Babylon. Okay, so Babylon is She is an entity. She is an intelligence. She is also an archetypal representation of what humanity considers to be divine feminine energy or the goddess. Okay. Due to her nature as a red goddess, um, a scarlet goddess, right? And we'll do another episode where we talk specifically about what the red goddess is, because I think that in modern practice, goddesses that we could identify as red goddesses are really, they seem to be the predominant goddesses that people are working with now. And if you understand what that is, what the red goddess is, that would make perfect sense when you look at the way that our world is working these days. But I want to say, due to her nature, specifically Babylon, specifically as a goddess, as an archetype, as an entity, due to her nature and the way that she tends to show up in the lives of the people who work with her, and just so many different practices, I'm going to tell you, just being completely honest, there really is probably no one reliable source of information for her. Most of the things that you're going to find written about her are going to hold some truth, but the reason for that is that she is so vast as a spirit. There is so much going on with her that everything that's written about her is potentially both true and untrue. And that's also something that is very much in keeping with the philosophy of something like the Red Goddess. She is very much a goddess of mystery. She's very much one of these goddesses. It's like, the more you learn about me, the less you understand me, kinds of a goddess, right? And that's why these goddesses, why the Red Goddess, or goddesses that would be identified as Red Goddesses, that's why they're so powerful, right? I think the term ineffable comes to mind, right? The ineffable Red Goddess, right? Even information that doesn't seem accurate could potentially become accurate, because red goddesses and Babylon specifically are also still in a constant state of evolution. And the reason for that is that not only are they as individual intelligences still evolving, because everything is evolving, but we as humans are also still evolving, which means our understanding of what these spirits are is also still going to be evolving. So learn as much as you can and pull information from as many sources as you can, because all of that ultimately is going to give you what you need as a foundation to cultivate your own knowledge and understanding of who this goddess is. Okay? And that's really what you need to do with a red goddess. You need to make your practice and your understanding of who she is just that. It needs to be yours personally. And it will probably be a bit different than many other people's. But that's good. That's a good thing. Okay. As I mentioned earlier, if you're looking for actual references, okay, the works of Aleister Crowley, okay, and the channeled writings behind Thelema. Looks like you've already kind of looked into that a bit. The archetypes of the Scarlet Woman or the Red Goddess, again, you're already familiar. Peter Gray's work, as I mentioned, is a good reference. I also think it would be good. This is one that I kind of stumbled across. It's oddly enough, like timing is so interesting how these things work, right? But within the last few weeks, I was having a conversation with someone else about the Red Goddess, and I did a little bit of a deep dive on resources that could be found online. And there is a reference out there. It's I don't think it's a book. I think it's actually just like a collection of essays that were prepared by someone, again, through a process of channeling, that seem to be devotional writings to the Scarlet Goddess or the Red Goddess, which is Babylon. And I believe the name of the collection of writings is actually In Nomine Babylon. So it's INNOMINE, In Nomine Babylon, BABALON, right? That's the spelling for the goddess, BABALON. Okay. But In Nomine Babylon, I think, would also maybe be good reference. And if I recall correctly, there's actually a PDF of that out there online. You can get that information for free if you just do a web search for that. Yeah. Okay. But that's going to really be kind of my answer for you on that one. So good luck. Very cool spirit. And I want to say a very empowering spirit, particularly in light of what we are all working to balance in our world today. So yeah, looks like that's it for listener questions. Actually, no, hold on, that is not it for listener questions. Let me take a quick look here. I apologize, I was not prepared. Let me find this other one here. Going back a few. All right. Okay, so comment. Actually, so this really isn't, well, it is a question also, but Person says, I used to wonder if dreams were an alternate dimension or dreamers could communicate with other dreamers. And maybe that's how someone could be talking to someone else through like sleep talking. Basically, I think this is in response to, again, to one of last week's questions, where again, we were really critical in response to that. And I think the reason that I kind of was so harsh in my reaction to that question is it felt to me almost as if the person who asked that question, the listener who asked that question, it felt to me as if they were deliberately being obtuse, like they were deliberately not sharing important pieces of that story, and therefore actively trying to deceive us. Or I would almost say, in some sense, maybe playing a game with us. And and I'm not trying to say that's indeed what was happening, but it felt like that. And I don't like people toying with particularly when we're trying to do a real thing here and we're actually trying to provide good info, right? So if that listener does bother to listen to another episode after we basically lambasted them, we were not nice in my response. I was not nice in my response to that. If you've decided to give us another chance, again, I apologize, and I would actually like to talk with you a bit more about that off air, to see if maybe I could get some of those additional details and then maybe actually give you an answer, okay, a good answer instead of just getting hostile. Okay. Anyway, it's funny that this question though, or this observation, because you're going to find in a lot of indigenous practices, I think specifically in the beliefs of the indigenous people of Australia. They used to be called Aboriginals, or Aborigines, but they don't care for that term, and I can absolutely see why. It's got really kind of fucked up associations with like being primitive, right? And these are not primitive people. In fact, I think the most of the indigenous communities out there, in many ways, they're way more advanced than what we would like to identify as modern civilized culture, right? Yeah, anyway, but I recall that in the beliefs of the indigenous people of Australia and New Zealand, that the waking world, what like the world I'm in right now as I'm recording this podcast, this is actually seen to be like, this is the dreaming, this is the dream time. And as I actually am asleep and dreaming, that's the real world. So this concept of this idea of how dreams can present alternate dimensions, or just different experiences of our existence, I think there's a lot of truth to that. There's a lot of basis for that, and it's not a new idea at all. So whether or not we could identify dreams as alternate dimensions of existence, that I'm not so sure about. That I kind of get a little like, that I don't know. Like from that gets to a point where I'm kind of like, okay, are we veering kind of into science fiction territory a bit, right? But who knows? I don't know. Nobody knows, right? Um, in answering some of what you said right here, I do believe that dreams, when we access dream states, I think that those give us an opportunity to, on a subconscious or unconscious level, to kind of be less, how to explain this? We're more open, I think, and I think that is something that gives me for me, it gives me more evidence to support the belief that we are all a part of a collective consciousness of some kind. And when we access altered states of consciousness, we are better able to connect to the collective, which is why I think we can see things like shared dreams or shared communication coming through dreams, right? Those are things I think that certainly do come up. We have enough evidence spiritually through spiritual phenomena and evidence of such. We have enough, I think, to say like, yeah, there could be something to this, right? So I believe that's probably what's happening in a situation like this. Yeah. But anyway, but thank you so much for the comment. I think it's a very good theory, and one that I have definitely have thought about quite a bit over the years as well. So that's pretty much it for this episode. I think I didn't really have anything else. I wanted to get some answers to those questions. We'll be back next week with Austin, and and we'll get back on like our regular kinds of episodes, right? Next week, I think we're going to touch back upon the topic of closed practices. I feel a need to discuss that again because that has been a discussion that we've actually been having a lot in person here at the shop again recently. It's amazing to me how these practices, these understandings of things, something as simple as, if it's something that you don't have access to, don't touch it, right? Like I don't know why that's so hard for a lot of people, and people will jump through some really amazing hoops and play some really intense mental gymnastics to try to justify why they should still be able to do the thing, even when the people that actually own the thing by blood and history and culture are saying, no, 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 no. Like people will still do some amazing things to justify why they can still have it. Um, yeah, oof, it's one of the worst examples of just spiritual colonizing. But we're going to talk about that a little bit next week and touch back upon that. We talked about that on an episode like I think almost 2 years ago. And it's time to have that conversation again, I think. So we'll be back next week with that and probably a few other cool things and hopefully some new listener questions. So thank you so much for writing out the last several minutes or a few minutes. I don't know how long I've been going at this now, but for being with me today for this episode. And as always, like, subscribe, send us comments, send us questions, right? Let us know if we're doing good. Let us know if we're doing bad, right? Whatever works for you, whatever you need to say. Okay. And I will plan on seeing you and chatting at you next week. Thanks so much.